They weren't just punished, they were destroyed. Medieval Europe turned justice into pure nightmare, using tools that ripped flesh, crushed bones, and burned victims alive. One peeled skin like fruit. Another let animals eat their way out. But what kind of justice system invents horrors like these? Stay with us, because what you're about to discover is beyond imagination. The Judas Cradle and Spanish Donkey. Among all the grotesque punishments devised during the Middle Ages, few can compare to the sheer anatomical cruelty of the Judas Cradle and the Spanish Donkey. These weren't just instruments of pain. They were tools of psychological warfare, designed to turn the human body against itself in the most humiliating and unforgettable ways. The Judas Cradle, a nightmarish invention believed to have originated in Italy, was deceptively simple in design. At first glance, it appeared to be just a pyramid affixed to a platform. However, the pyramid's pointed top was the centerpiece of an excruciating ritual. The condemned person would be stripped naked, bound with ropes, and hoisted into the air. Slowly, methodically, the executioners would lower the victim onto the sharpened apex, ensuring that the entire weight of the body was supported by either the anus or vagina. The pointed structure would stretch and tear the orifice apart, often causing severe internal damage. The victim's screams echoed in courtyards and stone-walled chambers as muscles ruptured and skin tore apart. Infection followed quickly, since sanitation was virtually non-existent. In many instances, the torture continued for hours. Some executioners added weights to the victim's legs, increasing the pressure and forcing the body deeper onto the spike, often resulting in fatal internal impalement. It was a slow, silent form of execution that left no blood on the floor, just shattered dignity and irreversible agony. If the Judas Cradle was a test of internal endurance, the Spanish Donkey was all about splitting the victim from below. Used across Europe, especially in inquisitorial courts, this device consisted of a wooden beam carved into a sharp triangular shape. Victims, often accused of heresy, theft, or insubordination, were forced to straddle the beam naked. Their entire body weight bore down on the thin edge that rested against their genitals and inner thighs. What made the Spanish Donkey even more monstrous was its customization. Torturers would attach heavy stones or iron weights to the victim's feet, dragging them down and pressing their flesh tighter against the wooden edge. The results were horrifying. Skin tore, arteries ruptured, and muscle fibers snapped as the beam slowly split the pelvis apart. In some recorded cases, the internal injuries were so severe that death came not from bleeding, but from shock or trauma-induced organ failure. There were no moments of mercy. The entire process was designed to break both the body and the spirit. While some were eventually removed from the device and treated if only to keep them alive for further questioning, others were simply left to die where they sat, with their bodies literally pulled apart from the groin down. What sets these two instruments apart from other medieval punishments is the eerie silence they often commanded. Unlike the theatrical executions carried out in public squares with gallows and drums, these tools operated in dim torture chambers or secluded prison courtyards. The victims' cries were heard only by guards and inquisitors, and sometimes by other prisoners awaiting their fate. It created a haunting chain of psychological terror, witnessing another's destruction while knowing your turn might be next. Surprisingly, both devices were used on men and women alike. The Middle Ages did not discriminate when it came to pain. Whether accused of adultery, rebellion, blasphemy, or thievery, anyone could find themselves slowly torn apart while helplessly straddling a pyramid or wooden edge. And still, these punishments were not just about physical torment. They were performances of control meant to silence dissidents and maintain order through the most primal language of fear. A common household tool was transformed into a terrifying instrument of execution. How exactly did it slice its way into medieval justice? Come with us to know. Saw torture. If there was ever a punishment that perfectly embodied cruelty disguised as simplicity, it was the medieval method known as saw torture. The tool itself was unremarkable, often no more than a large manual saw used by two men. But in the right or rather wrong hands, It became a terrifying mechanism of slow, deliberate mutilation. The kind of mutilation that didn't just end a life, but made the death itself a public horror story. Saw torture was usually reserved for what were deemed the most grievous crimes: treason, heresy, adultery, witchcraft, and sometimes even petty theft if the accused had angered the wrong noble. This punishment wasn't about justice. It was a spectacle designed to terrify. The condemned would first be stripped of all clothing, not just to increase shame, but to ensure a clean view for the gathered onlookers. Public participation was part of the punishment. The individual was then hung upside down, often by the ankles from a scaffold or beam. This position wasn't chosen at random. When a person is inverted, blood rushes to the brain. That might sound harmless, but it had one horrifying consequence. It kept the victim conscious for longer. A body sawed in this position would remain painfully aware for an extended period before finally succumbing to blood loss or shock. The executioners would begin at the groin or between the legs and slowly drag the saw down toward the head. They didn't need to rush. The process was intentionally sluggish. As the saw cut through muscle, organs, and bone, the victim would scream, thrash, and plead, often locked in a state of overwhelming pain and fear. There are recorded accounts of victims staying conscious well into the chest cavity, which means they witnessed their own destruction in the most literal sense. The sound of the blade scraping bone, the pressure cracking ribs, and the wet slide of entrails being sliced wasn't just excruciating for the victim. It often disturbed the crowd, but not always. In some towns, saw torture became a community event. Children were brought to watch. Bread was sold by vendors. The screams became background noise for the morality play unfolding before the masses. It wasn't about the crime, it was about reaffirming who held power. The exact origins of saw torture are difficult to pin down, but evidence of its use spans several cultures and centuries. It was popular in Eastern Europe during religious purges, and the Spanish Inquisition also made use of it. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, it was used as both a punishment and a deterrent against rebellion. One particularly disturbing account involves the 16th century Hungarian peasant leader György Dosa. Captured after a failed uprising, he was publicly tortured in a spectacle that included red-hot iron thrones and eventual sawing. His death was orchestrated not just to punish him, but to burn fear into the hearts of his followers. Saw torture required little skill. 2 men, a saw, and a platform were all it took. This accessibility meant it could be practiced by nearly any local authority. It wasn't limited to state executions. Some landlords and inquisitors took matters into their own hands, delivering this punishment without formal trials or any chance of appeal. There was no escape. Once the process began, no one intervened. Sometimes the crowd would chant. Sometimes they would remain silent. But always the fear remained, lingering long after the blood dried on the scaffold. What made saw torture especially terrifying was its message. It wasn't just about killing a person. It was about erasing them slowly, so each inch of their body told a story of pain and control. But what medieval invention was used to silence blasphemers, punish miscarriages, and destroy the human body from the inside out, one brutal twist at a time? Stay with us to know. Tears of anguish. There is something especially chilling about a device that punishes not only the body, but the perceived sins attached to it. The tear of anguish, also known as the choke pear, wasn't just a metal instrument. It was a symbolic weapon used to punish people for who they were, what they believed, or what their bodies had done. Its use was often tied to morality, sin, and fear, all twisted together into a single mechanical horror. The tear of anguish looked almost artistic at first glance. It was pear-shaped, crafted from iron or bronze, and divided into 4 curved segments. At its core was a screw mechanism. When twisted, the segments would slowly open outward. It was like watching a flower bloom in reverse, only it was blooming inside a human body. The placement of the device was as specific as it was brutal. It was inserted into the mouth for liars, heretics, and blasphemers. For women accused of inducing miscarriages or committing adultery, it was forced into the vagina. For those condemned for homosexuality or sodomy, it was pushed into the anus. Once inserted, the screw was turned. The pair expanded inside the body, stretching tissue, tearing muscle, and often snapping bone. It did not need to kill the person. That was not the point. It was there to mutilate and humiliate. The pain was indescribable. Victims often passed out from shock or blood loss. In the mouth, it could break the jaw and smash teeth. In the lower orifices, it ruptured internal organs and left lifelong injuries. In some cases, the torturers stopped before permanent damage occurred. This was done to prolong suffering or to extract confessions during trials by Inquisition. This device was particularly favored by religious authorities. Inquisitors during the 15th and 16th centuries used it liberally. It became a way to silence those who spoke against doctrine or questioned church authority. It was also used as a warning, blaspheme, and this could be your fate. One of the most horrifying aspects of the tear of anguish was its ceremonial use. The accused would often be bound to a wooden post or bench in full view of others awaiting questioning. The device was cleaned in front of them, and the screw mechanism was demonstrated with dramatic slowness. This psychological pressure caused many to confess before the pair ever touched their body. Survivors, when there were any, never walked away whole. Some lost the ability to speak, eat, or walk properly. Women frequently suffered permanent gynecological damage. In rare cases, surgeons were brought in afterward not to heal, but to preserve the body for future questioning. This was not just a tool of pain. It was a message. Your body is not your own. Your words, your actions, and even your thoughts belong to the authority that holds the pair. There are documented cases of its use in several European countries, though many records were destroyed or lost during revolts and wars. Museums in Germany, Austria, and Spain still house versions of this device, often under glass, silently echoing the screams of those who once endured its grip. Its name, Tear of Anguish, is strangely poetic. It implies a kind of sorrow, but this sorrow was not gentle. It was forged in fire, shaped into iron, and buried into flesh. If the silent destroyer unsettled you, this next punishment will haunt you even more. A brutal display of justice, it crushed bones with iron force as onlookers watched in savage delight. But what kind of wheel was designed to break people, not carry them? Let's find out. The breaking wheel. It was not merely a device. It was a declaration of dominance. It stood as a towering emblem of pain, publicly erected to twist bone and spirit alike. Used widely across medieval Europe, this form of execution was as much theatre as it was punishment. Crowds gathered not just to witness death, but to feel the power of law tearing through flesh. The apparatus looked deceptively simple, a large wooden wheel mounted horizontally or vertically on a post, its wooden spokes radiating outward. But what unfolded on that wheel was anything but simple. Once sentenced, the condemned would be tied spread eagle across the wheel, their limbs carefully positioned over the gaps between the spokes. This ensured that bones would not resist the blows. They would break cleanly, loudly, and visibly. Executioners did not use knives. They used heavy iron bars or wooden cudgels. Each swing was deliberate, each crack a calculated note in a symphony of destruction. Arms were broken first, then legs, ribs, and spine. If the goal was death, the strikes continued until life left the body. If the sentence called for torture without immediate execution, the process was paused, allowing the victim to remain alive in a twisted heap of shattered limbs. In some cases, the mutilated body was woven back through the spokes. The broken bones bent unnaturally around the wood as if the person had been sculpted into the wheel itself. There they remained, on public display, often for days. Birds would gather, flies would swarm. The smell of decay would signal to every passerby what became of those who defied authority. Survivors were rare, but they existed. One recorded case from 1581 speaks of a man who lived for 3 days after being broken in over a dozen places. He was forced to drink water poured down his shattered throat, kept barely alive so others could see the consequences of rebellion in living color. He begged for death. He was denied. This punishment wasn't limited to criminals. It was handed out to political dissidents, rebellious peasants, heretics, and even those falsely accused. For some rulers, the breaking wheel served as a tool of fear rather than justice. The message was simple: we can destroy you slowly, and no one will save you. Religious overtones added a cruel twist. The wheel was often associated with Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who was sentenced to die by a similar device. Legend says it shattered upon her touch. But real-world victims were not so fortunate. Their bones broke, their bodies twisted, their agony became part of the pageantry. Children were sometimes forced to watch. Parents would lift them onto their shoulders to ensure a good view. Vendors sold food. Church bells rang before the execution began, as if to bless what followed. The spectacle was complete, flesh torn in rhythm with cheering, silence falling only between the screams. Not even burial brought peace. In many towns, the remains of the broken were left on the wheel until rain, animals, or time removed them. Others were burned after days of rotting in the open air, still tied to the wood that had become their coffin. The breaking wheel was not just a machine. It was a psychological weapon. It did not simply kill. It announced itself with every crack of bone and painted fear into the minds of everyone watching. But what if death didn't come from a shattered body, but from thousands of tiny wounds, each one buried beneath your skin, hidden inside a chair made of pure agony? Iron chair. At first glance, the iron chair did not appear all that threatening. It resembled a throne carved for a tyrant, with wide armrests and a high, imposing back. But step closer and the illusion shattered. Hundreds of metal spikes lined every surface: seat, back, legs, arms, even the headrest. There was no escape from them. Every inch was a needle poised to pierce. This was not a weapon designed to kill quickly. It was created to wound with precision, bleed slowly, and terrify completely. The victim, stripped of all clothing, was forced onto the chair while still alive, fully conscious and fully aware of what awaited. Each movement drove the spikes deeper. Each breath became a gamble. Sit still, and you endured agony. Move slightly, and the pain worsened. Struggle, and your own body would tear itself apart. Leather straps held the arms, legs, and torso tight. Iron clamps secured the head in place. Once bound, the victim couldn't even flinch. With the restraints in place, the torturers would slowly turn screw mechanisms that tightened everything down. The spikes didn't puncture vital organs, at least not immediately. Instead, they penetrated shallow enough to cause excruciating pain without allowing the person to bleed out quickly. But that wasn't the end. In many cases, fires were lit beneath the chair. The metal would begin to heat. Now the victim was not only being impaled at hundreds of points across their body, but also being roasted from below. The spikes became searing hot, cooking flesh from the inside out. The smell of burning skin filled the chamber. Skin blistered, then split. Blood hissed as it boiled against red-hot iron. The screams were inhuman wails, so raw and guttural they sounded like something dragged from another world. Executioners often waited patiently as the heat did its work. Some even took pleasure in describing each stage of the suffering aloud, taunting the victim. Others made the condemned watch another person suffer in the chair, first turning the torture into a psychological gauntlet long before the physical torment even began. In many inquisitorial courts, the iron chair was not just a punishment, it was an interrogation tool. Victims were questioned while seated, with each refusal to answer resulting in a new turn of the restraints or more heat applied to the base. Some victims confessed immediately, their minds broken by the mere sight of the chair. Others tried to resist, but no one lasted long. The pain wasn't the only weapon. There was a calculated humiliation in this torture. To be stripped bare, bound like an animal, and left bleeding from hundreds of tiny wounds while strangers watched it turned punishment into theatre. And the audience? Often other prisoners, nobles or clergy who needed to be reminded of what happened to those who disobeyed. Some versions of the chair included spikes on the footrest, crushing toes into pulps of torn flesh. Others had spiked helmets, ensuring the head was immobilized and pierced no matter how the body shifted. And when the torturer was finished, if death had not yet arrived, the body would be unstrapped. The skin, now adhered to the iron spikes, often peeled away in strips as the victim was removed. Sometimes they were dragged out while still alive, screaming, bleeding, cooked. Most didn't survive. The iron chair didn't spill rivers of blood, it didn't have to. Its horror lay in its intimacy. Every wound was personal, every burn seared into flesh within inches of the victim's face. Every scream came from the deepest, most broken corners of the soul. But just when you think torture couldn't get more suffocating, it does. What happens when your skull becomes a screw? The next punishment didn't just hurt, it crushed the very core of your being. Head crusher. There are many ways to die, but only a few force you to feel your own skull collapse inward. The head crusher did not spill blood across the floor. It did not slice, whip, or tear. It crushed slowly, methodically, and without pause. The design was basic, but the pain it inflicted was not. The victim's head would be placed between a metal cap and a fixed base, their chin resting on a narrow metal bar. A vertical screw rose from the top, connected to a crank. As the executioner began to turn it, the top cap would descend inch by inch, closing the gap with the unyielding base. It was a vice, and your head was the wood. The first turns brought pressure. Teeth snapped in their sockets. The jawbones splintered like dry wood. As the screw continued to turn, the real horror began. The cheekbones shattered. The eye sockets caved in. The skull, once so protective, began to fold in on itself like a rotten fruit under a boot. The sound was unforgettable, a mix of cracking, squishing, and popping. The eyes were often the first to rupture. Blood and vitreous fluid streamed down the cheeks as pressure forced the eyeballs from their sockets. The nose collapsed, cartilage snapping with wet crunches. With each rotation, the pain escalated, yet the body was held still, locked in place by the crushing embrace of the device. This was not always an execution method. In many cases, it was used as a form of prelude to an appetizer to death. The point was to induce agony without immediate death. If the torturer stopped early, the victim could live. They would never speak the same again. Some lost the ability to eat or drink. Many went blind. A few, broken mentally as well as physically, begged to be finished. In some variations of the head crusher, spikes were added to the inside of the upper cap. These weren't there to speed up death. They were designed to puncture slowly, adding sharp pain to the overwhelming pressure. As the skull pressed upward, the spikes sank downward, meeting in the middle. This device was especially popular in regions influenced by the Spanish Inquisition, where confessions were prized more than lives. The accused were given a choice: speak, or let your thoughts be squashed into silence. It wasn't just the pain that made people confess, it was the sense of helplessness. You could feel your own destruction happening from the inside, and nothing could stop it. Psychologically, the head crusher had another terrifying feature. The victim could watch. Positioned upright, with mirrors sometimes placed in front of them, victims saw their own face distort as it crumbled. They saw blood leak from their nose and eyes. They watched their mouths open in screams they barely heard over the grinding metal. Executioners, trained to be both precise and merciless, took their time. They knew exactly how much pressure the human skull could endure. Some victims remained alive and conscious until the very final moments, when the cranium finally split and the brain was crushed like pulp between the plates. The remains were horrifying. Faces turned flat, heads caved inward like bowls. And the worst part, many of those broken skulls were left on display, hung from gates, set atop pikes, shown to others as a reminder, this is what happens when you speak the wrong words or believe the wrong thing. But if the head crusher suffocated you with stillness and steel, the next punishment added something far more primal into the mix. A living creature. Starved, trapped, and desperate to escape through the softest exit it could find your flesh. What happens when a ravenous animal is locked in a cage with only one way out, and that exit is through your body? Stay here to know. Rat torture. Some tortures use steel, others use fire. But the ones that linger longest in memory often use something that breathes. Rat torture was never about precise injury. It was about letting something terrifyingly simple do the work for you. Something with teeth, hunger, and panic. A rat will do anything to escape, even if the only path out is straight through your body. This punishment did not require a grand contraption. No spikes, no wheels, just a prisoner tied down on their back, a hollow metal bowl, and one very hungry rat. The process began quietly. The victim would be stripped and bound tightly to a table or stone slab. Their midsection, often the abdomen or chest, was left bare and exposed. Then came the rat, shaking, furious, and ravenous. It would be placed atop the skin and quickly covered with the metal bowl. Sometimes it was a bucket, sometimes a metal container. The key was the seal. No exits, no air. Then came the heat. A brazier of coals or a torch was brought beneath the metal. It was heated slowly, deliberately. The metal became warm, then hot, then scorching. Inside, the rat began to panic. It could smell its fur burning. It could feel its paws cooking on the metal. It had only one instinct left: escape. And it only had one direction to run downward. Claws pierced flesh. Teeth followed. It wasn't clean. The rat didn't know where it was going. It just knew it had to keep moving. It bit and tore and scratched in random directions, burrowing deeper into muscle, organs, and intestines. There was no mercy in this, just blind, desperate, unstoppable digging. The screams of the victim were unlike any other. They weren't immediate wails of pain. They started confused, almost disbelieving. But as the rat disappeared into the body, as the feeling of something alive wriggled inside their torso, the screams turned into shrieks so intense they often triggered vomiting or fainting. But the fainting didn't help. They were always revived because no one was allowed to die too quickly. Many prisoners survived long enough to feel the rat wriggle beneath their ribs. Others bled out while it was still chewing. Some even survived the initial attack, only to die days later from sepsis, fever, or internal bleeding. Rat torture wasn't just physical. It was psychological poison. The terror it instilled was deeper than any spike or club could reach. The idea that something living could enter your body and carve a tunnel through your insides without stopping was what made this method so feared. Victims began sobbing before the rat even touched them. And it wasn't always about death. Sometimes the rat wasn't allowed to get far. The torturers would remove the bowl early, slice the rat in half, and sew up the wound only to repeat the process days later on another part of the body. This method became particularly popular in parts of Eastern Europe and the Low Countries during times of rebellion. It didn't require skilled executioners. Any guard with a rat and a bucket could deliver unforgettable pain. The rats themselves were often starved for days. Some torturers would beat them beforehand to ensure aggression. Others kept a stable of wild caught rats for this very purpose. There was no ceremony, no trial. Just a warm bowl, a scream, and a silence that followed only after the body stopped twitching. Rat torture didn't require metal or craftsmanship. Just hunger. And it worked every time. But what kind of torture puts your body on display like a warning sign? And how long can someone survive while the world watches them rot? Come with us to know coffin torture. In the brutal world of medieval Europe, death was often a performance, and nothing turned suffering into a public spectacle quite like the coffin torture, also known as the gibbet. Used across Germany, France, and England from the 12th to the 17th centuries, this punishment turned the human body into a slow-rotting warning sign for every citizen who dared to step out of line. The victim was placed in a custom-built metal cage, usually made of thick iron bars welded or riveted into the shape of a human frame. There was no room to sit, no place to lie down, no position of comfort. Once locked inside, the cage became their world, an upright tomb suspended from a pole or gallows, often at the edge of a town or along a major road. These weren't always immediate death sentences. In many cases, the victim was placed in the coffin alive. Their crime could be theft, heresy, treason, or even blasphemy, especially during the later phases of the Inquisition and the witch trials of Central and Western Europe. And then they were left to die. The iron cage offered no shelter. The sun blistered the skin by day. Rain soaked them through the night. In winter, their fingers turned black with frostbite. Birds came to peck at the eyes. Rats climbed to gnaw at their feet. Insects swarmed the body. The person could scream all they wanted. That was the point. Villagers would pass by and stare. Some would throw food. Others threw rocks. Most just watched. Children were encouraged to look. Parents pointed and whispered, "Obey, or that will be you." In some towns, the punishment escalated. If the crime was severe, the cage was smeared with animal fat or honey to attract more insects. In cities like Cologne or Nuremberg, church records describe the victim's slow decomposition as a divine message God would reclaim their body in front of everyone. Once the person died, and it could take days, the cage remained. Their rotting corpses would hang for weeks, sometimes months. The smell blanketed the area. Skin fell away. Bones jutted through clothing. Limbs slumped. The body shriveled as birds and time did their work. But it didn't end there. Sometimes the corpses were removed only to be burned, scattered, or even dismembered and sent to other towns as examples. Other times the cages were left in place for generations, the bones turning to dust, while the metal frame became a permanent monument to fear. During the 14th century, after the Black Death swept through Europe, communities became even more obsessed with public punishment. People feared sin more than disease, and any act seen as a spiritual threat, apostasy, blasphemy, consorting with demons, could lead to the cage. In England, gibbeting became especially prominent after execution. The dead body of a criminal would be locked inside the cage and hung at a crossroads or near a harbour, so every traveller would see the consequences of disobedience. Some were tarred to preserve the corpse and prolong the spectacle. It was not enough to kill. The goal was to ruin the memory of the person, to erase their dignity, and to use their slow death as a sermon with no words, only flies, rot, and rusted iron. The cage made sure you died alone, but not unseen. And if you think that kind of cruelty was only reserved for men, you'd be wrong. Because in the darkest corners of medieval Europe, there was a tool designed especially for women, one that tore the body apart in the most gendered and vicious way imaginable. What kind of punishment was made to rip apart the female body claw by claw and leave behind a legacy of scars that lasted forever? Let us show you the torment they never talk about. Breast ripper. Among all the merciless punishments practiced in medieval Europe, the breast ripper stood out for one horrific reason. It was crafted not just to harm, but to target women specifically, in the most intimate and dehumanizing way imaginable. This was not a general tool of torture. It was a weapon of symbolic and physical destruction, used when the crime itself was considered a betrayal of womanhood. Known across regions of Germany, France, and Italy as the iron spider or the breast ripper, this torture device was usually forged from wrought iron. Its ends were sharpened into curved hooks or claws, shaped to grip a breast tightly. Some variants were attached to walls or posts, while others were handheld, clamped like pliers. But no matter the form, the function remained the same: to rip, shred, and mutilate. This device was used on women accused of adultery, witchcraft, self-induced abortion, heresy, or even blasphemy. Any action that was seen as violating the expected role of women in society, nurturing, submissive, pious, could lead to this punishment. Inquisitors and local judges believed that to shame the body was to purify the soul. But in truth, the tool existed to destroy the individual beyond repair. The process was carried out in public or in front of other prisoners to amplify humiliation. The woman would be stripped naked, her arms bound behind her, and her chest exposed to the crowd. Her cries and protests meant nothing. The iron ripper, often heated in a brazier beforehand, was clamped onto one breast. The torturer then ripped downward or sideways depending on the severity of the intended punishment. The hooks tore through skin and fat, severing muscle and veins. Blood gushed from the wound, soaking the floor and clothing. If the woman survived the first tear, the second breast followed. In some cases, only one was removed to keep her alive for further questioning. In others, the procedure continued until the victim collapsed in shock. The heat of the iron added a sickening hiss to the process. Burned flesh clung to the claws, adding a layer of seared agony to the already unspeakable pain. In some recorded cases, children were forced to watch their mothers suffer. Whether to punish the woman further or send a message to others, it painted a scene so traumatic it haunted generations. This was no accident. Torturers knew exactly what they were doing. The breasts were not chosen randomly. They represented nourishment, femininity, motherhood, all things medieval society expected women to embody. By destroying them, the punishment did more than maim. It sent a clear warning to every other woman. You exist to obey. Step out of line, and we will tear away what makes you a woman. Some victims survived, though survival was a curse. Infection followed. Scars were deep and disfiguring. Many were cast out of their villages, branded as witches or unclean, no longer fit for marriage or society. Their pain was not only physical but social. The punishment followed them long after the wounds closed. The breast ripper was also used during inquisitorial interrogations, especially during witch trials. Women were pressed for names of coven members, for confessions of flying with demons or speaking with the devil. Those who resisted were punished again and again, their bodies destroyed piece by piece. Today, versions of the iron spider can be seen in torture museums across Europe. Rusted, quiet. But once they hissed in fires and tore flesh from bone while onlookers watched in silence. If this cruelty revealed how specific, targeted and symbolic medieval torture could be, the next device offers no such subtlety. It didn't aim to humiliate. It aimed to obliterate the body's ability to walk by crushing it from the inside out. Could anything be more horrifying than a method so violent it ensured you'd never walk again even in the afterlife? Stay with us to uncover the torment. Knee splitter. If medieval Europe perfected the art of silencing with pain, it also mastered the art of control through mutilation. Some punishments were not meant to kill, they were meant to disable, to ruin movement, to destroy the body's ability to stand in defiance. The knee splitter was forged for precisely that purpose. Used primarily in Spain, Italy, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire during the height of the Inquisition, the knee splitter was a brutal iron device designed to crush the joint between the thigh and the shin, the very center of mobility. Victims of this punishment rarely walked again. Many never stood. Some never even screamed. They fainted the moment the device bit into their legs. The construction was deceptively simple. 2 thick blocks, either made of wood reinforced with iron or entirely of metal, were set opposing each other. Between them sat anywhere from 8 to 20 sharpened spikes, small, precise, and cruel. The leg was placed between the blocks, with the kneecap directly aligned at the center. Then a pair of screw-driven handles or rotating levers were used to crank the blocks toward each other. The moment the first spikes pierced skin, the pain was intense, but it was the next moments that created true terror. As the device tightened, the spikes bored deeper. Tendons snapped, ligaments ruptured, the kneecap cracked like porcelain under pressure. There was no way to keep still. The nerves in the leg fired like lightning. The body convulsed. And still, the device turned. Eventually, the cartilage was completely obliterated. Bone shards embedded into muscle. Blood poured freely into the open cavity. In some cases, the iron teeth crushed the knee so thoroughly that the shin bone and thigh bone ground together with an audible crunch. Victims often passed out. Some vomited from the pain before they lost consciousness. But torture didn't pause for weakness. Water was thrown on the face. Salts were pushed beneath the nose. Screams were expected and welcomed. The knee splitter was a favorite of inquisitors not just for its brutality, but for its strategic cruelty. Unlike the breast ripper or the iron chair, this device didn't always end in death. It ended in ruin. Once it was used, the victim was left unable to flee, kneel, or even stand for trial. It turned rebels into crawlers. It turned heretics into beggars. It made people small in the most literal sense. Records show it was used both on men and women, though particularly on those accused of sorcery, betrayal, or escaping custody. Sometimes it was used before the main execution to ensure the condemned could not resist or attempt escape. In other cases, it was used alone, leaving the mutilated to rot in a cell. The number of spikes often correlated with the status or supposed guilt of the accused. Higher-born prisoners might receive fewer spikes. The poor, the rebellious, the outspoken, they received full rows of sharpened iron. In certain courtrooms, the shattered knees of one victim were left on public display while others were interrogated. It was a warning, a demonstration. Obedience was no longer expected. It was demanded. And for those who survived, walking was not the only thing they lost. Without kneecaps, they could not kneel in church, work in the fields, or move through cities unaided. They were reduced to crawling figures, living reminders of what happened to those who stood against the church or the crown. But the next torment didn't need to break bones. It shattered minds without spilling a single drop of blood. How is that possible? Let us show you. Psychological torture. Not every form of torture in medieval Europe left behind torn flesh or shattered bones. Some left no visible scars at all, but their victims were never whole again. This was the realm of psychological torture, a method so insidious that it destroyed the person from the inside, eroding will, identity, and sanity without ever drawing blood. The inquisitors and jailers of the Middle Ages understood something terrifying, that fear, used properly, was more effective than fire or iron. And in the dark chambers beneath castles and cathedrals, they learned how to wield it like a blade. In many torture dungeons, victims were not hurt right away. They were first shown the devices: the iron chair, the breast ripper, the head crusher. These were displayed in flickering torchlight while the prisoner stood, chained and silent. Executioners would calmly describe what each one did, where the spikes entered, how long it took to die, what part of the body failed first. This was not for intimidation. It was a performance, and the mind was the stage. Prisoners were often forced to watch others undergo torture. They saw friends screaming, bones breaking, skin sizzling, the smell of burnt flesh, the echo of begging, the sound of steel grinding against bone, and then they were taken back to their cell, untouched but not unharmed. Sleep deprivation followed. Some were kept awake for days with cold water, blinding torchlight, or the constant clang of iron bars. Others were locked in total darkness for weeks, their sense of time stripped away. Meals became erratic, voices whispered through cracks in the stone. Some cells were rigged with drains to collect urine and blood from above, reminding the prisoner that pain was always near, always waiting. Sometimes prisoners were told that their families had been captured too, that their children were next, that their silence would cause others to suffer. These were lies, but lies spoken with such confidence and repetition that the mind began to believe them. In this way, the torturer turned hope into a weapon. And then the final blow, the threat of false hope. Inquisitors would offer mercy, a lighter sentence, a quick death, a reunion with family. All the prisoner had to do was confess. But confess to what? Many were innocent, caught in superstition or politics. So they stayed silent until silence itself became torture. The fear was relentless. The mind, left to rot, began to betray itself. Some prisoners started to hallucinate. Others mutilated their own bodies. A few went mad and confessed to crimes that never happened, consorting with devils, dancing with witches, cursing crops, or anything to make the waiting end. Psychological torture was especially effective during the Inquisition, where heresy was an invisible crime. You could be accused of reading the wrong book, speaking the wrong words, or dreaming the wrong dream. And you wouldn't know who reported you, or why, or if they were even real. The absence of pain became its own kind of punishment. You waited, and waited, until even the silence was unbearable. In some regions of France and Germany, specific chambers were built for mental torture. One Inquisition cell in Avignon had stone faces carved into the walls, all watching. In certain castles, prisoners were held in rooms with no corners, where voices echoed endlessly and sleep was impossible. Some prisoners were placed in iron masks shaped like demons, forced to wear them for days until they no longer remembered their own reflection. Others were led through mock trials, condemned again and again, until they began to believe their guilt. And when the door finally opened and the torturer arrived, most begged to be hurt because at least pain was something real. Some prisoners were released. They walked free, but they were hollowed out, eyes wide, hands trembling, afraid of shadows, afraid of sound, afraid of themselves. Torture did not always need to break bones. Sometimes it only needed to break belief. Because in medieval Europe, the worst prison was not always built of stone, it was built in the mind. Which of these medieval punishments shocked you the most? Could you imagine surviving even one of them? Share your thoughts in the comments below.